Welcome to this Q&A video. Does the news about the UK Supreme Court ruling finally kill Scottish independence? And what do you think about whether it should or not? For those who haven't seen it, this is the ruling that says that the Scottish devolved Parliament does not have the power to organise its own independence referendum. Such can only be done with the agreement of the UK government, which, for now at least, is said to be out of the question. Personally, I think this was the right decision, which isn't to presuppose what should or shouldn't happen with Scottish independence. Ultimately, if the Scottish people come to the settled will that they want to be independent, then of course that is what they should be. I mean, we believe in self-determination. But this was tested relatively recently in a referendum, and the Scots voted to remain part of the UK. At the time, the referendum was described as a once-in-a-generation operation. Now, all of a sudden, the side that lost wants to have another go. Is this because, since that referendum, opinion in Scotland has turned so decisively that there's now overwhelming evidence that that settled will has now emerged? Well, no. So instead, you have the prospect of constant attempts to just nudge over the 50% line. Because once you've voted independence, then there won't be another referendum in 2 years' time to rejoin the UK. Once you've crossed the line, you've crossed it. Kind of like losing your virginity. You know, it's down to you whether and when you do it. Once you've done it, there's no going back. So if a Scottish nationalist, every time the UK government does something unpopular, is going to try to ride that wave to get a major non-reversible constitutional change, that's not how that decision should be made. Ironically, if you hate having the Conservatives in the UK government, you'd probably want to stop voting for the SNP. As a Scotland-only party, they can never form the UK government, and nobody will go into coalition with them, because their demand would always be for independence. And Labour will find it much, much harder to win a working majority without the Scottish seats they used to win. So the SNP pretty much guarantee a Conservative government, and they're quite happy with that. A government in Westminster that Scots didn't vote for is their best argument for independence. They don't want to mess with that status quo. I think Scotland going independent would have huge costs, bring immense difficulties to Scotland because of how integrated it currently is in the economy of the rest of the country. But, you know, national identity is a powerful thing, as Ukraine is showing. It's the sort of thing that people will fight and die for. So it's entirely possible the nation could decide to put up with all those difficulties, that they would be a price worth paying. There's no evidence of that strength of sentiment at the moment. And I do think for the time being, the result of the last referendum should simply be accepted as the current state. Now, of course, people who have formed their ideology around independence will never accept that, which is why they shouldn't be allowed simply to keep trying until they get the answer they want, at which point they will then, of course, say everything is settled forever. Hi Mallen, is Elon Musk saving Twitter or killing it? And what do you make of him letting Donald Trump back while not doing the same for Alex Jones? Like all questions that are framed, is it this extreme or is it the opposite extreme? The answer is neither. I think Musk has shown in this case that having created or developed several innovative and groundbreaking businesses doesn't give you a magic formula that can simply be transferred onto any other business in any other sector. He's made a very poor job of his first few weeks in control of Twitter, really just blundering around and putting the stability of the whole operation at risk in the short term. Now, is that akin to destroying it? Not really. There's been a mass exodus of engineers that leaves the platform in a fragile position short term. There may be some service outages in the short term, but he can hire a bunch of new engineers who are happy to support the new ownership and the approach. So there's no reason why the whole thing would just collapse. And there are some pretty brilliant engineers who are quite libertarian in their outlook, some of whom at least have become interested in the project. One of them, George Hotz, pointed out that when Instagram was bought by Facebook, at which point I think it had 300 million users, it was just 6 engineers who kept that platform going. Now, Twitter may well need more than that, but does it need the thousands that it had? Well, maybe, maybe not. The idea that Musk would spend over $40 billion And then when all the left-leaning engineers went, he just watch it die and conclude that nothing could be done to stop it, doesn't seem like a thing that's likely to happen. Some of the people who use Twitter on the left, who have extreme positions about people they disagree with being allowed to say stuff in public, well, they may well leave, at least in the short term. Some of them will probably be back, some of them won't. There is an opportunity there for a powerful rival to rise up, become a real alternative. There's just no evidence that any of the ones currently being touted have the ability to do that. So if Musk hires more engineers and Twitter goes on, does that constitute saving it? Well, not really. You asked what I think about Trump being allowed back, Alex Jones not being. First of all, I think you can justify that split on entirely objective grounds based on justifiable terms and conditions. But that's not remotely what Musk did, obviously. I mean, he ran a poll on Trump. Some would argue that he'd clearly made up his mind on that already. I'm not a mind reader, so I don't know whether they're right about that. But then he said no to Alex Jones because he has a personal aversion to anyone who might have exploited a situation with the deaths of children, which Jones has been found in a court of law to have done. Now, on the one hand, that is not a satisfactory process. One owner making decisions on the fly based on his personal feelings about people and certain issues. You can argue that it's the sort of thing that should have a properly defined and spelled out process so that it's fair and transparent and understandable to all users. And I agree. But Musk's defenders are right to point out, well, it certainly wasn't how it was working before. What you had were decidedly untransparent rules, which were applied apparently according to the political preferences of those behind the scenes, who could use them as a veneer of objectivity, whilst actually giving no explanation to support their decisions. And that's the point. What we had before was obviously broken. People able to be banned from Twitter for expressing an opinion which could be cast as hateful based on definitions exclusively used by activists on the political left. And then those decisions not being explained. People were not told specifically what they'd said that was said to break the rules. So no, that wasn't an objective and accountable process either. You might argue, as some have, well, at least Musk now is taking personal responsibility for what he decides to allow back and who to ban. But the whole rationale for him stepping in to save it is that it's an important part of the digital public square, and so should have some basic free speech rules in place. That means that although it can be down to the whim of an individual, it shouldn't be. It should be what the last lot said it was, only actually done properly. Do I think Trump should have been allowed back? Well, of course, he was a former president of the United States. He's a politically important figure. You may hate what he says, and some of what he said in the past has been plain wrong, some of it wasn't. If he called for violence, then those messages should have been removed. But he didn't. Of course, you can read between the lines in that over-imaginative way and say that he was dog-whistling and he was encouraging people to violence while maintaining plausible deniability. That's why you have proper rules, fully defined, able to be judged against what someone actually says rather than what their political opponents attribute to them. I think Elon Musk had the opportunity to stir up social media, force it to answer some difficult questions, to save it, maybe, if you will. Unfortunately, he has been, at least in this beginning stage, too random, too self-indulgent, too inconsistent, just not very serious. So his ability and authority to do that has become diminished. It won't kill Twitter, it won't save it. It's just another chapter in the exploration of how this technology is going wrong before our eyes. And that isn't a technology question, it's a governance question. How ideologically captured is the Labour Party, in your opinion? The question have then added a bit more in terms of context. My local branch has a poster in the window headed "Can't pay, won't pay," which positively encourages us to shoplift, claiming that the poor are only poor because rich people have taken from them, and therefore restoring justice requires us to rob Tesco's. A leaflet which I picked up inside claimed that secondary schools are so horribly sexist that draconian rules need to be brought in to keep the boys in check. The evidence being the occasional usage of phrases such as "you throw like a girl." Generally, I think the terms of reference to the question are wrong, because political parties are the legitimate place for an expression of ideology. One could talk about the fact a party used to have one clearly defined identity, for instance in the case of a Labour Party, that being the political representation of working class people, and that it had then become transformed by a different ideology. What you're referencing is modern day leftist identity politics, but parties have always evolved, political ideas have always changed with the times, so I don't think it's about what we would describe as ideological capture. It's about whether the ideology they choose to represent is capable or deserving of the political support they would need to get elected and then form a government. So if we reframed the question, is the modern Labour Party electable if it plays to the woke leftist agenda, I would say the answer to that is probably not. But it's reasonably clear that Keir Starmer, the party leader, knows that, and he's aiming to steer the party towards less troublesome centre-left ideas reminiscent of the Tony Blair era. And it's always been a factor with the Labour Party, as indeed it is today with most political parties of both the left and the right, that elements of the base are a lot more radical than the leadership. And that means you will find individual branches or locations where the radicals are fully dominant. You'll find the worst examples of self-indulgence that their opponents could justifiably point at. The modern Labour Party wants to be in government in 2 years' time. Its leadership knows that it will only do that if it is the sober, sensible party of the centre-ish, while the Tories continue to self-destruct in full view of the electorate. It's not guaranteed they're going to be able to pull that off, because the radical base on the left, traditionally more self-indulgent and anti the leadership than that on the right. Although the Conservatives have now been in power for so long, they are in a very fractious phase. So maybe the left will self-sabotage, which you could decide to describe as institutional capture. But for me, the phenomenon of institutional capture is where organisations that are supposed to be non-ideological, doing a job of work, whether it be health, education, infrastructure, maintenance, whatever it might be, when they adopt an ideological filter that begins to distort what it's possible to do. Teachers teaching ideologically inspired falsehoods as though they were objective truth, for instance. There is a lot of institutional capture going on that we should be worried about. The political parties are the least of it, because they are at least forced to put their ideology up in front of the public. It's what gets done out of sight that is the danger. Do wind turbines have dangerous unintended consequences? I've seen rumblings that they slaughter birds and dampen winds, affecting weather patterns. It's difficult for me to separate fact from FUD, fear, uncertainty and doubt. I did do a video looking at the questions around wind turbines, which I'll link in the video description. It's certainly true that the killing of birds, particularly birds of prey, is a serious downside. Some research has been going on into ways to reduce that impact. So, for instance, it appears that if the blades are painted black, then it reduces the amount of kill. Obviously, there are also sighting considerations, avoiding the well-used migration routes for different birds, for instance. When I researched that video, didn't find any credible evidence that there was a broad impact of turbines affecting weather patterns, so I don't see where that comes from. But it's like all of these things. Every energy source that we can use at scale comes with advantages and disadvantages, which includes some negative impacts. Nuclear power, fossil fuels, wind power, solar power, hydrogen, biofuels, all of them. Any balanced approach to achieving the best energy mix is going to set its non-negotiable parameters, because the world's largely concluding that over a period of transition, the shift away from carbon emissions is a key one that it's committed to. And then within that, you have to establish the best mix, with all the sources having the mix of pluses and minuses. As I've said before, it's predominantly an engineering problem to be solved, and you should distrust the words of anyone who has decided to become passionately for or against an energy source based on the sort of thing that their identity group tends to support. They are the ones who will tell you there are no downsides whatsoever to their favoured source, renewables for instance, And some of those people went to extreme lengths to cover up the negative impact on birds when it was first uncovered, before more objective scientists insisted on studying it. They're also the ones who will tell you that there's nothing good about renewables. Those people might promote nuclear, but often only because the other side hate nuclear, so they use it as a stick to beat them with. It's all just games. But yes, if you want to see a deep dive into some of the research on the impact of turbines, I refer you to that video I did previously. This next question is a long one. Couldn't quite see how to shorten it without losing important detail. A recent study from the Washington University School of Medicine, published on November 10th in Nature Medicine, claims that repeat SARS-CoV-2 infections contribute significant additional risk of adverse health conditions in multiple organ systems. Such outcomes include hospitalization, disorders affecting the lungs, heart, brain and the body's blood, musculoskeletal and gastrointestinal systems, and even death. This made headlines all around the world and was quoted by politicians and health experts. All real-world evidence shows this cannot be the case, since Omicron infection numbers have risen and negative outcomes have sunk. And a summary analysis of the study shows its evident flaws. They used positive tested cases in the denominator, not real infection numbers. How can this happen at such a high level? There are two aspects in this question which I'll take in order, because the first is about whether this specific case is correctly described. The second is more generally about how can major errors be made at high-level research published in the most respected journals. The question's really about the latter, but I can't go to that and skate over the founding premise. Now, I don't have time to do original research for Q&A videos. If I were looking at this in a methodical way, I would find the paper. Well, I've done that much at least. It's this one. I'll investigate the discussion around it. What are the arguments being made by whom? What evidence supports those arguments, and so on. Now, I don't have time to do that, but the very brief scouting that I did do made me suspicious about the proposition that this paper is clearly and obviously flawed that you've just made. For one thing, the first argument you make is plainly not logical. The essence of the paper is that if you're reinfected with COVID, having been previously infected, you're more likely to have additional damage done to you than you were from the first infection. I can see why people would get excited about this sort of thing because of a rather cartoon-level debate about whether having had COVID once gives you fabulous natural immunity versus the other side who seem determined to brush aside anything that might avoid the logic that you should have a vaccination jab. Obviously, this paper plays into that whole dynamic. But your argument this paper cannot be right because, quote, since Omicron infection numbers have risen and negative outcomes have sunk. I don't see that has anything to do with what I understand this paper to be about. The second time you get infected, there is a certain likelihood of worse damage. Omicron is less harmful overall, thankfully, than the earlier variants, but that principle of potential harm from reinfection can still hold in spite of that. Now, when an argument's put forward that is at that level, it gives me the suspicion that the attacks are coming from the highly motivated but not expert critics. So I try to find the source of such criticisms, who's making them, whether, for instance, there's a letter or a counterpaper published in the journal or present in any of the online mainstream sources. I didn't look long or hard, but initial searches found no such evidence. And then normally the next step would be to ask you for your own sources that you're quoting, so that I could then go directly to those and see what they're based on, what references they use, what substance there is to them. As far as I can see, this research was done with a large study group. Now, it's just one study. The group wasn't one that's overall representative of a wider population, so you'd want to look at that. But it was large enough that you would take it seriously as a contribution. I don't have a strong view about whether I want it to be right or not, because I don't have preferences about what medical research should say. Just a curiosity about, what it does say and why. Like the energy sources question, we need to be suspicious of those who have a highly developed preference for a specific view of a particular disease or a fondness for one type of medical intervention over another. Such people are likely to be projecting their preferences onto the research, not taking evidence and using it to form their opinions. Now, I don't know, that may be unfair to your sources. If I was doing the research, I'd look past those initial red flags and try to look with an open mind to see what was there of substance. But on the wider point, there is a considerable amount of actual junk research that makes it into the peer-reviewed journals, particularly in the areas of medicine, where you have powerful commercial interests involved, and areas like psychology, where some of the ideological capture questions can come into play. It happens because there's a huge quantity of research published every year. There is no perfect system for weeding out bad or fraudulent research before it gets published. But once it's out there, the process doesn't stop. And one of the information sources I routinely monitor is the feed from Retraction Watch, which reports on all the papers that have recently been retracted for reasons from undeclared conflicts of interest, plagiarism, all the way through to evidence of fraud. It happens because of misaligned incentives, basic human failings, but the really important stuff, and anything connected with COVID that has the potential significant import will qualify, does get significant scrutiny, and one can hope that the bad things get found out and retracted. Just because some group on the internet says a paper has been debunked is no reason on its own to believe them unless they can point to a retraction or an expression of concern or some other evidence. People decide that their opponents have been debunked all the time without even trying to meet any sort of objective standard of evidence. Now, I will confess to a degree of frustration about the information landscape this all leaves us with. I am very curious to know what things the current orthodoxy is getting wrong. But when so much of what presents itself as a solidly based challenge turns out to have zero credible substance, working out what even has enough merit to spend time looking into is pretty tricky. All of us only have so many hours in a day. We don't want to waste them on the nonsense. But then, of course, you run the risk of missing the genuine gold, which you can't always tell from a distance. Final question. 1 person out of every 6 in the UK was born abroad. Is that too many? Immigration remains a live debate across the West, of course. The questioner then added this context. All cultures change. Is this something we should embrace? I'm very aware that my reaction to this is emotional. I'm afraid that my tribe is losing its distinctiveness. This thinking is often portrayed as racist, which I think is unfair. It's a topic that deserves more time and nuance than is possible in a Q&A video, for sure. One of the things that's very common to human beings across the world is that we hate rapid change to the things that we become familiar with and that we value. When we see statistics about levels of immigration, well, that on its own doesn't really disturb people much. But when they see their own communities changing in character because there's been a large, sudden influx of people who then form their own sub-communities, don't seek to assimilate, that's when you get much stronger reactions. And let's be clear, the concern that creates leads some people to go beyond fear of difference, becoming genuinely, explicitly racist, prejudiced in principle against people because of their race. And it's the existence of those people that casts a shadow on the others who are feeling that something important is being lost and makes it difficult to have a sensible conversation about it. The habit of those on the political left of accusing everyone else of racism as soon as any such discussions come up, that has a chilling effect on so much of the discourse, to the degree where certain criminal scandals were allowed to progress for years, because the police were terrified that if they identified a problem deriving from a subset of an ethnic group in their community, they would be accused of racism. Like the criminal grooming gang sexually exploiting underage girls. Shocking abuse that was allowed to continue for an extended period. So we don't want that chilling effect, thank you very much. This is a Q&A. I don't have the studies to hand, but I've certainly seen studies that suggest that highly cohesive communities based on a single national culture tend to be high trust communities, which has a number of benefits. Multicultural communities where no attempt is made for people to assimilate to the national culture, they tend to become lower trust societies with various consequences that flow from that. Now, that doesn't mean that the exact quantity of people who were or weren't born in your country is important. It's down to how much people accept and seek to become a part of the shared identity that you're buying into. I know numerous people who are not born in the UK. some of whom originate from Eastern Europe or Russia, who are exemplary citizens. Their presence enriches our culture and our economy, and they're here because they value those things. The point is that you can build a diverse nation in terms of ethnic origin if you have that strong shared identity or can develop it. If you do that, matters not in the slightest what percentage of those living in it were actually born into it. But if you fail to achieve that, then it significantly constrains how much difference, at what pace of change, to what concentration you can have before your community begins to react against it. All right, that's all for today. Thanks to the Patreon supporters for the questions. See you all for the news roundup on Friday. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.